Okay, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the final for today, I think, event on gender hosted within the UK Pavilion. We're really pleased to have this final session on women count, achieving gender equality through improved monitoring and reporting. In the UK Pavilion on Gender Day, we've focused and chosen to focus on a range of different aspects of gender because we think it's a critical part of our response to tackle climate and to support resilience. And we think it's an area where we need more work, we need more evidence, we've got a whole lot of enthusiasm and experience to build from, and it's really important to use fora like this to really start that conversation and exchange. We know that the impacts of climate change impact disproportionately on women and girls in vulnerable settings and communities. We know also that to achieve change, to tap into the potential and brilliance around the world to solve this fundamental crisis, we need everybody at that table, and that includes women and girls. So we have to really figure out how do we move this agenda forward. We also have an expression that I partially believe, I can't say I fully believe, is what you don't count, you don't care about. And so we're focusing this session on counting, both counting the importance of women, but also getting the data streams that we need to understand whether we're doing enough, whether we're having success, whether the finance is flowing to the right places. And that is all about the other aspect of counting. And sorry, just to tell you who I am and why I'm here. My name's Charlotte Watts. I'm the Chief Scientist at Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. As a scientist, I care about numbers, I care about enumeration. I'm also a female scientist, and I'm probably a female scientist because I was a feminist, and when I was a kid, I was told that women don't do science. So I'm also here just as somebody who passionately believes in the importance of getting women's voices, getting data about women's experiencing, and also generating the evidence about what makes a difference to girls. So that's why I'm here in my personal passion for this in this issue as well. So on the panel today, we have Angie Dazzi. So Angie is Senior Policy Advisor and Gender Equality Lead for the International Institute for Sustainable Development. So Angie's work includes analysis, guidance, and technical support for the National Adaptation Plan process through the NAP Global Network. And Angie's been recognised for her work in this area, and indeed she was included in Apolitical's 100 Most Influential People in Gender Policy. Respect, that's pretty good. There's also Saranja Gupti, who is a community resilience advisor for the Harrow, I'm going to get it wrong, I'm sorry, Commission. And her work includes policy advocacy, facilitating learning exchanges, and documenting grassroots women's accomplishments. So fantastic compliment. And lastly, but not least, we have Sai Rachela, who's Deputy Executive Director for Arrow. And at Arrow, Sai has been involved in the advocacy and monitoring of the 2030 Agenda on the SDGs and coordinated the Global South monitoring of the International Conference on Population and Development Programme of Action. So I'm really thrilled to be joined by these remarkable women who are all leaders in their field. I just want to acknowledge this is an all-female panel, and actually it's just come after another all-female panel. And actually I think it's because there's such central leadership for women on this agenda, but clearly this is an issue of gender. This is an issue that is for women and men to engage in. But I think actually it's apt that we learn from women who are leaders and pioneers in this area. And so actually I feel quite comfortable in this case in being on an all-female panel. But I hope as we open up to conversations, we'll also get a good debate, including both men and women. And lovely to see a number of men in the audience. So the way this session's going to work, we're going to have a series of presentations. Each presentation will be about 10 minutes long because we want you to hear the substance of the work that each of these amazing women are doing, and then we'll open it up to questions, and then I really want us to have a really lively conversation. With that, I want to first, sorry, I'm just looking at the running order. I first want to invite Angie up to the podium.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here today with all of you, and thanks so much to the UK government for organizing this event and inviting me to be part of it. I'm going to share a few insights on tracking progress on gender-responsive adaptation to climate change based on our work with governments through the National Adaptation Plan, or NAP Global Network. According to the Least Developed Country Expert Group's latest update, 129 countries have taken steps to move forward on their NAP processes. And it's important to keep in mind that NAPs are about much more than documents. They're an ongoing iterative process that aims to strategically integrate climate change in decision-making across sectors and across levels of governance. NAP processes involve stakeholder engagement, establishment of institutional arrangements, strategic planning, and mobilization of resources for implementing adaptation actions. And they also involve the establishment of systems to monitor actions, evaluate outcomes, and capture learning from adaptation. These processes are going to guide investments in adaptation by governments, by civil society, by the private sector, and by development partners over the coming years. So that means they're a really important entry point for gender-responsive climate action. To begin, I just wanted to reiterate why we need to integrate gender considerations in adaptation, monitoring, evaluation, and learning, or MEL, as you may hear me saying throughout the presentation. So first, a gender-responsive approach is fundamental if adaptation is going to be effective and sustainable. We know this from decades of development experience. If we don't address underlying causes of vulnerability, including gender inequality, including discrimination, including denial of rights, the outcomes just won't be sustained. We need to apply this learning in our efforts to adapt to climate change. Next, we have a mandate to integrate gender into climate action, outlined in the Paris Agreement and in the UNFCCC Gender Action Plan. And so if we want to track progress in realizing this ambition, we need to integrate gender considerations in MEL for adaptation. When we're looking at these systems, we need to look at both tracking progress on gender in the process, in terms of planning and implementing adaptation actions, and also the outcomes, so the results from our investments in adaptation. So this is by no means comprehensive, but I wanted to give just a quick overview of what we're looking at when we're talking about tracking gender in adaptation processes and outcomes. So when it comes to the process side of things, we're looking at things like the framing of adaptation and whether gender and social issues figure in this framing. We want to know whether an intersectional gender lens has been applied at key decision points in the NAP process throughout planning, budgeting, implementing, and so on. There's also the question of expertise. Have gender and social experts been involved, and have they been able to influence the process? And finally, has the process been participatory? Whose voices were heard and whose weren't heard? When we're looking at the outcome side of things, we want to consider things like, have people of all genders and social groups had equal opportunities to participate in the implementation of adaptation actions? Do outcomes from adaptation actions yield equitable benefits for people of all genders and social groups? And if not, who is not benefiting? The what we don't count question. We need to look at how gender-responsive adaptation action is contributing to progress towards gender equality more broadly. And we need to look at what's been learned about gender-responsive approaches to adaptation in terms of what works and what doesn't. So I'm just going to go through a few examples that illustrate how we as the NAP Global Network and our country partners are trying to move forward on some of these questions. I'll start with the global view. So one of the things that we've been doing as the NAP Global Network is tracking how countries are integrating gender considerations in their NAP processes. We've put out 2 synthesis reports on this, one in 2018 and one in 2020, and our next one will come out early next year, but we've done a bit of a quick update so that we could talk about the status now at COP. Looking at the 25 NAP documents that had been submitted to the UNFCCC by the end of September, we found that 96% mentioned gender issues. This includes references to gender as a guiding principle for the NAP process and also commitments to gender equality as an objective of the process overall. 88% of the documents specifically mention women, most often positioned as a particularly vulnerable group. However, when we looked at the change in the positioning of women in the documents from 2018 to 2020, we found there has been significant progress in terms of women being recognized as stakeholders in adaptation. And in our latest analysis, we found that more than half of the documents identify women as agents of change, not just as particularly vulnerable. We also found a considerable increase in evidence that countries are using gender analysis to inform their adaptation planning processes. And where we saw less progress was in areas like inclusive and gender equitable stakeholder engagement and consideration of gender in institutional arrangements for adaptation. Turning now to some country-level examples, a number of countries in the Pacific are using what they call integrated vulnerability assessments to inform their NAP processes with local-level data and analysis in a standardized approach at the national level. These assessments are also serving to establish the baseline situation because they provide insights into vulnerability in key areas like community health and food security. The data collection process involves focus group discussions, and in most cases, these are happening with gender and age-specific groups so that they can collect disaggregated data. Burkina Faso's NAP identifies a number of gender-focused strategic objectives. Among these is a commitment to building the resilience of members of women's groups through income-generating activities. And they identify milestones so that they can track progress towards these outcomes. For example, in this case, that women have been provided with appropriate facilities and technologies to support their employment. With support from the UK government, we've been working with a number of countries to complete adaptation communications, linking these to their national adaptation plan processes. And we found that some countries are using this as an opportunity to communicate progress on different aspects of adaptation, including on gender-responsive adaptation action. Ghana, for example, summarized its gender-related commitments in its climate policy suite, and they noted that a full-time gender advisor is working on the NAP process. And their adaptation communication also highlights a number of adaptation initiatives that have already been implemented that integrate these gender considerations. So these are just a few examples to provide you with a bit of a snapshot of the progress. There are plenty more. Countries are working away really hard to bring these issues into their monitoring, evaluation, and learning systems for adaptation. And to close, I just wanted to share a few thoughts on the way forward. First, it's important that gender actors are involved in the development of MEL systems. They provide essential expertise that needs to be applied. We need to ensure that the teams that are collecting and analyzing data are gender balanced and that they're inclusive of diverse backgrounds and knowledge types. It's essential that MEL systems for adaptation include indicators of gender equality and women's empowerment so that we can track progress towards this broader agenda. We need to collect disaggregated data by gender, but also by other characteristics like age and ethnicity, and use intersectional gender analysis to assess both the process and the outcomes of adaptation actions. And lastly, we need to evaluate the gender-differentiated impacts of adaptation options and adjust course if these aren't equitable and if the most vulnerable people are not being reached. And that's what I wanted to share today. If you're interested in more information, please don't hesitate to visit our website, the NAP Global Network. You'll find our synthesis reports. We have country gender analysis reports that are super interesting and provide really rich analysis. And we also have a toolkit that we developed with the Least Developed Countries Expert Group and the Adaptation Committee of the UNFCCC that includes a whole bunch of other country examples that I couldn't speak about today. And with that, I will thank you very much, and I'm going to turn it over to Saranjana.
Great, thanks, Saranjana.
Oh, sorry. Sorry? That's a slide? Okay. Thank you so much. It's a privilege to be here among such distinguished speakers to speak on the issues of gender in relation to climate resilience. My name is Suranjana, and I'm from the Vairo Commission. And I just want to take a minute to tell you about the name of this organization because people often wonder. Somebody just asked me yesterday, what's with your Japanese name? We don't get it. And it's actually, Vairo is actually a small town outside of Beijing. And in the 1995 Global Women's Conference, the governments met in Beijing and the NGOs were sent off to meet in Vairo. And that's when this group came together and decided to focus on grassroots women's leadership in advancing more socially and economically just, resilient, sustainable communities. So our work essentially focuses on the leadership of grassroots women. When I say grassroots, I really mean women living and working every day in low-income and poor communities who are marginalized, but also whose everyday lives are characterized by huge development deficits, particularly in housing, basic services, infrastructure, and it's hard, I mean, even for them to access government programs. I'm going to lay out some reflections which I hope will give everybody a little bit of food for thought. And I'll try to share a little bit of a few examples through that as well. I think when we talk about integrating gender considerations into policy, let's try and sort of unpack what does this really mean for us. In the Vairo Commission, we work particularly with groups on the ground, organized women's groups, and so we believe that a gender-sensitive policy or program or plan is actually one that works for grassroots women from their perspective. So it's very important to sort of unpack and deconstruct this whole discussion. When we talk about gender, and we talk mainly about grassroots women's empowerment in this process, we're looking at who's driving the agenda, who's benefiting, who's learning, who's monitoring, who's evaluating, who's getting feedback, who's engaged in public decision-making processes that look at what's working and not working. And I think some organizing concepts or principles around our work in this area are three things that I'll share with you. The first is that if you see grassroots women not just as beneficiaries and victims, but rather as leaders, as drivers, as innovators, then your perspective is going to be completely different from this conventional perspective we have, where professionals are essentially driving the agendas and making assumptions of what grassroots women want and need and can do. The second is when you see grassroots women's organizations as drivers of change, you have to put resources in their hands. You have to get money, flexible money and flexible resources into the hands of grassroots groups to enable them to address local challenges that they're experiencing every day as part of both development and climate change and disasters that's all exacerbating the development deficits that they experience every day. And when you do that, you have to change your whole perspective again, because you realize that for these women on the ground, they're not just looking at climate change, right? They're looking at everyday problems of poverty and development that are aggravated by small and big disasters and crises like the COVID crisis, right? And then finally, you have to ask yourself the question around learning, that who's learning, where is knowledge coming from, whose data, what are we using the data for, and so on. So let me give you some sense of how we've approached these questions. When you look at the idea of investing financial resources in women's groups, we use part of the grants that we get at the global level to channel money to our member groups. We have 21 core organizations who drive our resilience work at the grassroots level, and we have channeled resources through what we call a community resilience fund. And these funds go to grassroots women's organizations, and the funds allow them to map their risks and vulnerabilities, to prioritize actions, to make plans, to test, adapt, innovate, and essentially to demonstrate what they're capable of doing and then leverage that with local authorities to then partner with them, to access budgets and jointly collaborate to advance local agendas. So we have many groups who are working with local governments. They gain access to municipal budgets. They're leveraging those budgets together with the municipality. They're able to go, or together with their barangays in the Philippines, they're able to go to the municipality, ask for infrastructure upgrades and those kinds of investments. So we have a long list of examples there where women's groups are already doing this. And then we come to the issue of knowledge and learning. Now, I think we have to be very clear that there is a constant real tension between professional researchers and grassroots organizations, where they often feel that their knowledge and information is being extracted and they don't really benefit from it. And so I think that we have to create relationships and partnerships and synergies which actually work for grassroots women, and recognize that there's huge power in community data, in putting data in women's hands, but also having them gather, analyze, and use data. And all over the world, we saw this happen during the COVID crisis. We saw that there were gaps in the way that government databases work. We saw that they couldn't deliver entitlements to some of the most vulnerable groups because their databases are often not updated for 5 and 10 years. And we saw that it was grassroots women, organized groups who knew where the most vulnerable people are located, who needs help, who needs food, who needs to go to the doctor, or who needs medical assistance to be tested or treated. And it was women's groups who were actually doing this. So it's my theory that grassroots women's groups are the ones who are often contributing to making social protection programs more shock responsive, because of this hyper-local data that they have and this localized information and the relationships that they have. So we have to recognize that when we talk about monitoring and evaluation. And then finally, I think it's very important for us to pull all of this together so that grassroots women can show both themselves and understand what their own contribution is, but also have it recognized externally. So we have to support groups to innovate and test. We have to be able to deal with failure and not be punitive in monitoring and evaluation processes which punish people for failing. We have to be able to take on risks. Everyone today in this conference is talking about innovation and adaptation. One innovation requires 10 failures or 50 failures. So let's be clear about that. And, we have to look at risk as part of something that is built into the system. We have to be able to take risks around testing solutions, and we have to be able to learn from failure. Actually, we learn much more from failure than from success. And we have to help grassroots women's organizations create track records which help them leverage more assistance from governments. And we know that even where there are fantastic government programs and policies in place, and there are, so for example, let's say in Indonesia, where you have very progressive process of decentralization, or in India where you have affirmative action at the local level, you still need a lot of investment with grassroots or in grassroots organizations to support those who have been historically marginalized from public decision-making processes, to have the confidence and the capacities to engage in public planning and public decision-making processes, and to be able to drive public agendas. So we have lots of examples in our network of grassroots women's organizations being appointed to monitor programs, and that I think we should learn from that, and that's something that the Gender Action Plan needs to take away from these discussions, that if we want these programs to work on the ground, if we want to look at accountability in a way that's not just about accountability to donors and global organizations, but accountability to organizations working with poor people where we are meant to deliver impact. I think we have to keep in mind that a lot of money is being raised and spent in the name of poor people's organizations, of grassroots women's organizations. So it's very important that we make sure that we are accountable to those women and those organizations who are supposed to benefit and be empowered through the programs and policies that we are formulating in building resilience and in advancing the fight against climate change, to actually create women's groups who are being empowered through our resilience building policies and programs. But we also have to acknowledge that the more empowered they are, the more they can contribute through their leadership to building the resilience of their households and their communities. And we need to keep scaling up the work that's already underway. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Brilliant. And now I'd like to invite Sai up to the podium.
So after those very insightful presentations by both my previous speakers, I think great insights have come in. And I think my presentation will feed into that a discussion further. And hello and good day to everyone. My name is Sai, and I represent the Asian Pacific Resource and Research Center for Women. We are a regional women's organization. And we are a feminist organization, and we work on gender, sexuality, but we also look at the intersections of sexual and reproductive health and rights with climate change. And one of Arrow's very key strategy has been monitoring international commitments pertaining to women's health. And one of our work has been monitoring the ICPD program of action. And many of you might know the International Conference on Population and Development has been a key conference which actually put sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights into the UN language, and as a result of which reproductive rights is being upheld. And we also monitor the Beijing Platform for Action, but also the SDGs, in order to see the progress gaps and challenges and how they are panning out and how they are making an impact in the lives of women. And Arrow actually works in about 15 countries in the region, in the Asia and the Pacific region. And so that is one of our key strategies. In regards to climate change, we have been in this area, and then we've been working with national partners, including women and youth-led organizations. And we have been looking at gender equality, SRHR, and climate change, but also disaster risk reduction through knowledge generation, research, and as well as innovative programs, which working with the partners and especially young people. And today is Gender Day, and all of us have been talking about Gender Action Plan. I have listened to many presentations since morning, but I think that is a great step that all of us have taken forward. The Gender Action Plan, we know it recognizes climate change impact on women and men. It is different, and it actually talks about the gender inequalities and the multidimensional factors that are especially pronounced in the developing countries. We see these inequalities exacerbate mostly in the developing countries. But also the Gender Action Plan, actually, it gives us a position where capacity building, knowledge management, and sharing of experiences, this is something that has been designed within the Gender Action Plan, which can be seen as an opportunity for all of us to work with. Arrow, as I've said, we've been working on research, and the most recent monitoring report that we have is accelerating gender-responsive climate action through empowered CSOs. This is the work that has been done. And this report actually shines light on what are the capacity gaps that are experienced by CSOs in advocating for gender mainstreaming in climate change, disaster risk reduction plans, policies, and projects. And we all know, what do we know thus far, because this report also looks at what is the situation in regards to the Asia and the Pacific region. And what we know is climate and disaster risk-induced vulnerabilities of men and women, and the ultimate impacts, should these risks realize, are not gender neutral. I think we know this for sure now. And women and girls in all their diversities, they are disproportionately bearing these adverse impacts due to already pre-existing vulnerabilities. And the pre-existing vulnerabilities and the structural barriers are something that include social and cultural barriers, especially in our part of the world, in the global south countries, the burden that women face, the productive, the reproductive, and as well as the community work. Even in the context of COVID, we have seen women have been in the front lines, and they have been doing community work as well in order to, and these have actually impact on how women are facing the structural barriers. They spend 3 times as many hours as men in unpaid domestic care work, and that is also recognized. And women and girls in developing countries, they spend up to 10 hours a week gathering fuel and 15 hours a week collecting water. We are talking of context where LIC, this less wealthy countries, I would not call least developed countries, but less wealthy countries, and countries in the global south, these are the barriers that they face. At the same time, there are also the legislative barriers. There are discriminatory laws that are present, the laws on marriage, the inheritance laws, unequal divorce, and other laws, which actually, again, create barriers for women to access and control over the resources. And there was one study that was done by FAO, which actually said that in a 15-country study, it actually shows that gender equality in land ownership and control of national legal frameworks is something that is, again, which women are at a disadvantage. The other aspect that we have also seen are institutional barriers. So women's participation in policy, political, and institutional decision-making spaces, although progress is being made, it is not up to the mark, especially in the countries, in the global south. But also when such representation is there, it is mostly tokenistic. And these are some of the numbers that we see: 25% only of women in parliaments, 36% in local governments, and 23% as ministers. The most important aspect is technology, because in the context of COVID as well, we have seen technology has played a a great role, and women have been at a disadvantage when it comes to technology. Technology is not gender neutral, and as a result of which, there is also data that shows that women have less access to mobile phones, and even if they have a mobile phone, access to internet is not available. And we are living in a world where the whole world is moving towards technology and digitalization. Again, the structural barriers are also in terms of information, and information barriers are about understanding of the climate risks. We're talking about women who are exposed or vulnerable to climate crisis, and their lack of access to information. That's one information gap. But also, in terms of data, there is lack of data that actually tells us what is the situation around who are the ones who are most impacted by climate crisis, what is the data talking to us about adaptation and mitigation, and what are the access points for women when it comes to climate change. So these are the structural barriers that have come in play, and that report my colleague will actually be sharing with you. It's a report that has been done in collaboration with UN Women. And as a result of this, I think three key negative outcomes is what we see is loss of livelihoods, assets, and resources. Here, I will just give you an example about a study in Myanmar where women have lost 80% of domestic livestock, like animals, because the kind of animals that women take care of or use for their livelihoods are animals like pigs, goats, and poultry. But when it comes to men, it's a different set of animals, and then as a result of which you do see that the loss of livelihood, when you compare it relatively, women are at a disadvantage. I have already talked about the triple burden that women face and the longer distances that they will have to go to in order to access water, in order to access daily resources, and that puts girls to drop out of schools, but also face physical and sexual violence. Again, as a result of climate crisis, there is increase in mortality and morbidity. Especially what we have seen is sexual and reproductive health and rights are least prioritized in humanitarian settings, and food, water, medicine within families after typhoons have actually increased infant mortality. And also, in this context, we're talking about gender from a very binary lens, and looking at gender in all its dimension is also a progress that we need to make towards. So the report actually comes up with certain recommendations, and especially this is focused on women's organizations and CSOs, and as well as women. But it tells us that technical knowledge needs to be designed from a gender responsive, gender specific, and gender transformative way. There needs to be technical knowledge or basic knowledge that needs to be available for women in order to tackle climate emergencies. It also talks about advancing leadership capacities of women, but also women CSOs. And it talks about advocacy capacities to engage with the local governments. I think what Suranjana has talked about, these are some of the barriers that come into play, and these recommendations will actually help to put in place certain mechanisms on the ground that will help women and women-led CSOs to adapt better. But also it talks about addressing gender and climate policy frameworks, but also building a national framework for monitoring and evaluation. So these are some of the results that have come out of that report. We will be sharing that report with you, and thank you for listening.
So brilliant. I think a really great combination of very complementary presentations here. So I'm really keen that we get some audience participation. So please, if you do have a question, put your hand up. We've got a roving mic. Put your hand up if you're going to ask a question, thinking of one, because I'll either group them if they're a load or I'll do them individually if there aren't. I can see a clustering of questions over on the left, so let's take that clustering and then I'll pass them out and ask you guys just to pick up the ones that are relevant for you, if that's okay. Over to the mic.
Hello. Thank you so much. That was fantastic presentations. Elise Belcher from Global Network for Disaster Reduction. We're talking a lot about accountability rather than monitoring and evaluation, especially because monitoring and evaluation are power-loaded words. I monitor you, I evaluate you. How do we flip it? So we should actually be accountable to the women that are most at risk. Therefore, some of what you've said is maybe us monitoring what they're doing and what successes they are having. How do we switch that so we become more accountable and they become more leaders of their own situation, as you've described?
Great. I'm going to take a couple more questions and then go back to the panel here. There's a person behind you, if you don't mind.
Hi. To the first speaker, I noticed that you mentioned specifically an intersectional gender analysis. And I know that you mentioned adding other like criteria to measure, such as sexuality or gender identity. But could you elaborate a little bit more about what the gender analysis part in terms of intersectional gender analysis means? Thank you.
Great. And there was a third hand up over here, the gentleman there.
Hi, thank you. First of all, fantastic presentations, deeply insightful. My question is for the second present, for Ms. Gupta. So you mentioned the fact that there's, as NGOs operating, especially foreign-funded NGOs, we have very little room for failure, and that relates to how our donors feel about our projects. So I just want to add a couple of things and then ask you a question. So first of all, as a result of this, I mean, we tend to, I wouldn't say write false, but at least sugarcoat our monitoring and evaluation reports. Secondly, what ends up happening is that our communities are also very well aware of this. And when we don't infantilize them, that's when we start to realize that they know our agendas as well as our donors' agendas. And they help us in that sugarcoating. Third, what is sometimes good for our communities, especially for marginalized and especially for remote communities, is often not going to be very attractive for our donors. So do you have any thoughts on how we can address this challenge, especially on a forum like this, I mean, where we have a wonderful amount of access all of a sudden? So yeah, I'd just love to hear your thoughts on how we can help our donors understand the more complex subtleties of our work. Thank you.
Brilliant. Great combination of questions. So I'm going to throw them. I'm just going to work down here and you can pick up whichever question you want to answer. And then just to reassure people on this side of the room, I'm coming to you next, so be warned.
Great. Is this on? Yeah, thanks for the question. So, I mean, gender analysis is fundamentally about understanding differences between women, men, and non-binary people in terms of rights, opportunities, access to resources, all of these issues that are influenced by gender. And taking an intersectional approach to that recognizes that women are not a homogeneous group, men are not a homogeneous group. There are lots of other factors that influence, in this case, how vulnerable people are to climate change and what capacities and opportunities they have to adapt. So an intersectional gender analysis tries to further disaggregate, not just by gender, but by other factors that influence people's lived experiences, the discrimination they face, and therefore the situation that they're in when they're facing the impacts of climate change.
So thanks for those questions. Did you introduce yourself? Who are you?
Ahmed Al-Maki. It's a very difficult name, I'm sorry. But I'm a master's student at Duke University and I work in community-based low-level conservation in the north of
All right. So I'll take both those questions that came from GNDR and this young man. I think that I think when you talk about, I thought I was talking about reversing accountability, because the whole notion of monitoring, evaluation are very much lodged inside a framework of accountability, right? So we have to shift that whole framework and say, who has to be accountable to whom, because this sort of whole, what we're doing is a little tiring, and it's too many years of doing this, and it's part of how we prevent empowerment, actually. We're then coming in the way of empowerment, the very thing that we are supposed to be doing. So I think we have to, and I'm not saying we know everything about it, but we have to get grassroots women to actually deliberate and think about and share what it is that progress means to them. How do they capture it? What is their understanding and what is their experience of the projects that we are putting out, and the activities that we're doing in them. And we have to give them the space, to figure out what it is that actually works for them. And we have to have the courage to hear that, and we have to be able to listen to that. I personally, been in this sort of dilemma where people are saying to me, it's not the disaster that, it's not the flooding that bothers us. It's really the notion of eviction. That is a much bigger threat for us. And all I'm thinking is, oh my God, what am I going to write in the report? So, because we're working on natural hazard-based disasters, right? We're not working on eviction. We're not working, in that sense, on human-made disasters in that same way. So we, as professionals, come with these, very rigid silos and categories. The donors are even worse, I dare say. And then we can't hear what people are saying to us, that, this is not what we want. So today, if you go to, organizations of women who are poor, and you put money in their hands, they immediately headed towards livelihoods. If you say what's the biggest problem in the communities, it could be infrastructure, it could be basic services, it could be something, So we have to learn how to have those conversations. And the way you learn is by having many more of those conversations and not being daunted by how messy and confusing and difficult they are. Because what I find is, nobody wants to talk to people. I'll get technology, I'll get an intermediary, I'll get this, I'll get that. Anything to keep me away from listening to and talking to actual poor women on the ground. So it's terribly messy and it's very difficult, but we have to learn to talk and converse and have those dialogues. I think the question about the room for failure, sugarcoating, I think in my experience, and now I have about 20 to 25 years of experience, I think where we have succeeded is where we have built very strong relationships and partnerships with, whether they're donors or whatever kind of partners or NGOs, where we can speak frankly, no matter what the rules are, we can actually tell them what is working, what we can deliver, what we can't, what we need to fix. And, we are part of, the Vairo Commission is part of an initiative called the Frontline Funds Accelerator, where we are working together with IIED, the Slum Dwellers International, the Climate Justice Resilience Fund is also supporting it, and we have this, and GRP, the Global Resilience Partnership, and we are really together as a set of partners. And even though we're like-minded, it's taken us a long time to get on the same page, speak to one another, figure out what, bring up sort of very diverse capacities together to actually say, okay, this is really what we want to do and what we can do together. And I mean, so far as this sort of sugarcoating and whatever, I think everybody has to now, as part of this sort of urgent action we have to take, we have to also be able to tell donors what works and what doesn't. I mean, what is this whole log frame and forcing us to forcing us to measure things that we can't measure well, and therefore, actually pushing us to, let's say, restrict or simplify our deliverables to what we can measure. That also doesn't work. Of course, it's important to measure and capture progress, but this, then we are ending up then saying that, this will be easy to count, so let's do that. But that's not the most challenging problem that we have to deal with. So I think it's time to talk frankly, and we have to be ready for that. And a big part of it is also, I think this dealing with failure also means that we have to have good long time frames. Because in the short run, what looks like a failure is just a glitch, and you'll learn from it and you'll move forward. So the moment you're looking at a one-year project, your perspective is very different from when you're looking at 7 and 10 years. And I'm happy to say that, the Asian Development Bank has this program called the Community Resilience Partnership Program, which focuses a lot on women's groups, and they're looking at a 7-year investment in which the FCDO is invested in. So, things are changing. We have to capitalize on that and move forward quickly.
Great, thanks.
I'll simply intervene on the first question. And it's not just about monitoring. I think for us, what's important is to look at the linkages of monitoring and learning. So these have to be seen together. And once we bring this nexus together, I think we will make a headway.
Brilliant, great. Okay, we're going to go to this side of the room now. A woman here has been very patient. If you do want to ask a question on this side, please put your hand up. And I know there's a gentleman over here who did have his hand up as well. Over to you.
Thank you. Maite Rodriguez, I'm from Guatemala. I'm also here with the Wider Commission, so I'm going to follow up a little bit on Suranjana's side, but on the other side of the regions. And we are working globally, Latin America, also in Asia and Africa. But I mean, this is maybe just for a conversation, with both of you. Because when we are working on doing this kind of monitoring and evaluation, I'm coming from a facilitating NGO, we said, no, because we don't want to say international. We are very national, but we are working regional. So it means like working and supporting grassroots women organizations, all affiliated or associated. And we found something very interesting. For example, it's very different, and it's very, very completely opposite. If you want to work with programs, I mean, like a programs from an agency or I mean, like a projects, when you are working with organizations, base organizations, I mean, like grassroots organizations, because in this sense, when you are working together to define indicators, because for measuring, for monitoring, or for doing these baselines, you need to have some indicators from the beginning, intermediate, and the final. So means like we were very able, and I think we are working on that, even for us, as has been very useful, to work relating indicators and measuring with the theory of change of each of the organizations. Because otherwise it's different. Otherwise it's going to be like just doing numbers or just doing quantity, but not quality, or not really having producing some kind of difference among, like being organized and being working to really make a real change or something like that.
Great, thank you. And you wanted to ask a question as well.
Hi everyone, I'm Emma. I'm the head of girls' education at the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. Thank you for some smashing presentations, really good takeaways on what donors can do better. Can you share with us some insights on role model governments? Because at the end of the day, we're also talking about national action, and I'd find it really helpful to go away with some really key messages so I can impart them on your behalf with others. Thanks.
Brilliant. Because of time, I think we're not going to have any more questions, but can I sneak one in? Because the question I wanted to ask, and this is in your world, if you could think up of any piece of data that you could magically create or collect linked to this agenda, and it could be about anybody, anything, any organization, what would it be? So that's my, what are the good governments? and then mine, in a look forward, actually, what would your dream piece of data be? Because I've just heard about actually who's accountable to who, and all of these issues coming out quite strongly in this. I don't know who wants to have a go with her question and my question in combination.
I can start. Yeah. Just responding to the question from our friend from my team. Yeah, I think we at Arrow, when we do the monitoring work, for example, even taking the case of the SDG indicators, what we do is we actually look at more rights-based and gender-sensitive indicators in addition to the existing indicators in order to complement further and provide more nuanced information around that indicator. Now, for example, just adolescent birth rate, and that comes to adolescents here. Adolescent birth rate is an indicator within the SDGs, but just adolescent birth rate will not help us know exactly where the problem lies. We will have to look at disaggregation and how the disaggregation happens, where exactly, rural, urban, poor, wealthy. So those disaggregation of data, and this has been our advocacy work as well, to look at disaggregation. So these are those nuanced rights perspective and the gender perspective we try to add in our monitoring work. So that was just to add to that point. And what do we like to see? I think what we like in the context of climate crisis, climate emergency, I think we like to see that women are able to hold the local bodies accountable. And if women are able to do that, it actually fits within what you are doing, the work. But if women are empowered and they have their agency in order to, hold the local bodies accountable, because at this moment in time, we are holding the gender action plan accountable, or we are holding accountability at a more global, regional, national level. But I think real change would happen when local women are able to hold their local bodies accountable.
So I have two or three actually. One is the question of how are you incentivizing government bodies or government departments, whether it's local or national, to engage and work with grassroots women's organizations. So, second is what kind of public leadership or decision-making role do they have, not just in implementation, but in designing, planning, implementing, monitoring, very important, monitoring as well, right? Third, very important, how much money is going to grassroots women's organizations, right? So these are my three.
I excuse you the three because they were great.
I'm kind of picking up on what you said, and I think for me, it's not data, it's more analysis, but I would really like to see more synthesized, concrete evidence of the difference it makes when women, for example, participate in local governance structures. How does that lead to better outcomes? When policy processes are gender responsive, how does that lead to better programs and services delivered to people in the governments that are developing those policies and implementing them in partnership? And so I feel like there's lots of lovely anecdotal evidence, but I would really love to see much more synthesized evidence so we don't have to make the case that this is the right thing to do. We have easy ways to point to this will lead to better outcomes, and we have the evidence to back that up.
Brilliant. Sadly, we have to end here. The light's flashing at me. It's been a great session. Fantastic set of speakers, wonderful audience, really interesting questions. So thank you so much. Lots of takeaways. Clearly, gender is so critical. We all know that, but still 20% of countries, am I right, hadn't mentioned women in one of the figures you showed me in terms of their plans. Clearly, the really meaningful engagement with grassroots organizations is a core part of that. We need to listen rather than solely impart, thinking we have the answers, thinking we know the priorities. And this issue of data is central, and it's about accountability to a range of issues, but really that through our investments, through our joint action, we are really having an impact in creating resilience, not just thinking we are, and pretending and not recognizing risks and failure, and not really diverting and ensuring that resources are going to the actions that will really make a difference. So thank you everybody. It's been great to have this day focused on gender. It's been lovely to have this session. Hope you have a good rest of the evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much.